It begins not with rage, not with heartbreak, not with a collapse, but with silence. The kind that settles over a room long after the voices have gone quiet, long after the laughter became cautious, and long after the man inside stopped asking to be seen. He sits in the house he helped build, but it no longer feels like home. The walls still stand, the photos still hang, but something essential has gone missing. Not an object, not even a person, something harder to name. Maybe it's him. There's a chair in the corner he used to love. Now it stares back at him like a stranger. The kitchen still smells like rosemary and Sunday roast, but it no longer feels warm. The bedroom is neat, organized, curated, yet cold. Too quiet, too clean, too distant. And in that quiet a question rises, not spoken, not shouted, but whispered like breath in a cathedral. Why am I living like this? He has done everything right. He has provided, protected, endured. He's held his tongue when insulted, swallowed his exhaustion, adjusted himself 1,000 times to keep the peace. He has worn the armor of manhood so well that no one noticed the bruises underneath. But something in him is beginning to stir. A crack in the routine, a tremble in the mask, a subtle refusal to keep pretending that love should feel like duty and home should feel like exile. Here lies the paradox. He is strong enough to carry the world, yet fragile in the arms that no longer hold him with tenderness. Carl Jung once wrote, "What you most need to find will be found where you least want to look." And perhaps the darkness creeping at the edges of his consciousness is not there to destroy him, but to lead him back to something he abandoned long ago, back to a voice inside that doesn't ask to be good, but to be real. Because what breaks a man is not the weight of the world, but the quiet erosion of being unseen in his own life. This is not the beginning of a breakdown. This is the first breath of awakening, and if you stay with me, we'll go further. Into the rooms he doesn't show, into the masks he forgot he was wearing, into the sacred unraveling that must come before a man can remember who he truly is. So take a breath. This is not a rescue. This is a return. There's a silence that settles over a man not when the world abandons him, but when the home he built no longer echoes with belonging. He wakes before the sun, works until he's numb, returns to a house filled with furniture but void of warmth. He does everything right, yet something essential has gone missing. And perhaps the most haunting part of all is that no one notices, not even him, until one day he realizes he has become invisible in the very space where he was once the center. This isn't a story of failure. It's a story of a slow erasure, 1,000 tiny accommodations, 1,000,000 small trades of selfhood for peace. He doesn't call it abuse. He calls it compromise. He doesn't feel broken, just tired. He doesn't cry, not because he isn't hurting, but because he's forgotten how. It didn't begin with malice. It rarely does. It began with love or something that looked like it. Words spoken in soft tones, touches that lingered just long enough to feel like magic. And yet over time, those same touches became commands. Those same words became measurements. He was no longer being loved for who he was, but for how well he fit her design. Christina Hoff Sommers once named it for what it is, a culture of selective empathy. A societal lens so focused on the wounds of women that it forgets men bleed too, even when the blood doesn't stain. Emotional exhaustion becomes normal. Constant vigilance replaces safety. And still he stays. Because somewhere deep down, he's been taught that love requires endurance, and masculinity means silence. The tragedy is not that he suffers. The tragedy is that he doesn't know it's allowed to hurt. What she offers is not cruelty, it's conditional affection. The love that whispers, "Be more for me or I'll be less for you." It's not loud. It doesn't bruise the skin. It changes the rhythm of his heartbeat, makes him check his words twice, his tone 3 times. Her disapproval becomes the weather inside his body. A drop in her mood and his day darkens. A sigh from her lips and his chest tightens. He learns the rituals well. Flowers after arguments. Apologies for things he never said. Gifts in place of boundaries. Her silence becomes sacred and his voice becomes blasphemy. He calls this devotion, but it is, in truth, the funeral of his freedom. Some women do not want a partner. They want a projection. A man who is not a man but a tool, a mirror, a stepping stone, a provider. Not all, but enough. Enough that the pain isn't rare. Enough that it echoes across bedrooms and bathrooms and empty dinner tables. And the men who endure it, they aren't weak. They are deeply, tragically loyal. And then comes the hardest truth. When a man gives everything, his peace, his health, his dreams, and she sacrifices nothing in return, it is not a relationship. It is a contract unspoken. A ledger where only one side is charged. The rhythm of this life is steady but sad. There's a script and he plays it well. The good man, the protector, the steady one. And because he plays it so perfectly, no one checks if he's still breathing beneath the lines. But the story must shift. At some point, a man wakes up and asks a forbidden question. What if this isn't love? What if I'm not being seen but used? What if I am not her equal but her emotional employee? The answer isn't easy. It never is, because it means pulling off the mask. It means facing the unbearable grief of being unloved not for your failures but for your humanity. But in that pain, a new rhythm begins. Slower, truer. One not dictated by fear of rejection but by the pulse of returning to yourself. You were never supposed to be her reflection. You were meant to be whole, and love, real love, never asks you to vanish to be worthy. What's left then is silence, but not the kind that suffocates, the kind that heals, the kind that waits, the kind that allows a man to say quietly but clearly, I remember who I am. And maybe that's where the real story begins. They say being seen is the most human longing, to have someone look at you and not flinch, to be known, not in fragments but in fullness. And yet, there is a cruelty more subtle than indifference, being seen not as you are, but as what someone hopes you might become. In the beginning, you mistake her gaze for recognition. She looks at you with intensity and you feel chosen. You feel real. But over time, that gaze begins to shape you. Not gently, but insistently. You adjust your voice, you trim your edges, you soften your truths. Because the love you thought you received wasn't for the man you are, it was for the role you were drafted to play. And so begins the performance. The gifts become offerings to a God you don't believe in. The apologies come before the accusation. You apologize not because you're wrong, but because the silence after a disagreement becomes unbearable. You learn to read the air like scripture, what words are safe, which moods require sacrifice. Your affection is not returned, it is audited. This is not seen, this is scanned. Christina Hoff Sommers warned us of this quiet tragedy. A culture that offers empathy by ration. A currency reserved for one gender while the other stands bleeding in emotional poverty. Men are not allowed to name their wounds unless they come with jokes or rage or complete collapse. Anything softer is dismissed. Anything vulnerable is suspect. So you bury it, all of it. You swallow the shame, the confusion, the ache of being miscast in your own story. You pretend that the attention you're receiving is love. You tell yourself it's normal to be loved for your potential, not your presence. You call it growth, but it is erosion. And the mirror she holds up to you day after day, it doesn't show your face. It shows her fantasy, her longing, her design. It reflects not your soul, but your usefulness. And slowly, terribly, you start to disappear. You think you're evolving, but you're shrinking. You think you're becoming what she needs, but you're abandoning what you are. What no one tells you is this. When you are loved for your possibility, you are never allowed to stop performing. The moment you falter, when your mask slips, when your exhaustion bleeds through, she doesn't adjust the fantasy. She replaces the actor. Because this was never about you. And maybe that's the hardest thing to accept. The love you thought you had was not a shelter, but a spotlight. And you were always one bad scene away from being written out. But a man cannot survive inside a mirror. He needs earth. He needs breath. He needs to be more than someone else's reflection. The tragedy is not that she failed to see you. The tragedy is that you stopped seeing yourself. Not all wounds wear bruises. Some nest in silence, in the pause between words that should have come, in the coldness that slips in just after intimacy, in the way she looks at you, not with cruelty but with disappointment, like a teacher watching a failing student, like a mother reevaluating a son. And you feel it, don't you? That subtle shift in temperature, that pressure to do just a little more, to be just a little better, not because you've done anything wrong, but because love in her world is a performance and you're falling out of rhythm. You don't name it abuse. You're not allowed to. It doesn't scream. It doesn't break things. It suggests, it withholds, it lingers. And so you learn the rituals: a good morning text, a mid-afternoon check-in, flowers when she grows quiet, a planned date night to erase her boredom, an apology for your tone, though your words were kind. You learn to predict her moods the way sailors study the sea, hoping to avoid storms, even if it means never leaving the harbor. You call this love, but it is ceremony, it is performance, it is survival dressed as romance. You are no longer living, you are maintaining access, and every day you disappear a little more beneath the mask you wear to stay accepted. She does not say, "Be different or I will leave." That would be too obvious, too honest. Instead, she says nothing and watches what silence makes you do. And because you've been trained to chase warmth like a dog abandoned in winter, you respond. You work harder, you smile wider, you give more. But the more you give, the less you remain. Until one day you catch your reflection and realize you haven't seen your own eyes in weeks. The rituals you perform are not for love. They are offerings to a God that never speaks, never blesses, only accepts and punishes. And when the offering is insufficient, you are not told why. You are left to guess. She does not have to raise her voice. She only has to raise her expectations. And because your worth has been tethered to her comfort, you respond again and again and again. But this is not connection. This is conditioning. The tragedy is that you think you are being intimate, but you are being trained. And the love you think you're preserving is not love, it is leverage. You are not a partner, you are a peacekeeper, a smile in a house growing colder. And no one warns you that emotional servitude often wears a velvet glove. So you stay, because staying feels noble, because leaving feels like failure, because you've been told that endurance is virtue, that sacrifice is sacred, that if you love enough, it will be enough. But it never is, because the rituals were never meant to make you worthy. They were meant to make you quiet. At some point, the performance begins to crack, not loudly, but like a hairline fracture in glass, spreading silently with every forced smile, every swallowed word, every night spent wondering why you feel so utterly alone next to someone who says she loves you. It begins when you catch yourself watching your life like a movie you no longer recognize. And then, quietly, the realization arrives. You are not chained, you are not threatened, you are not beaten, but you are not free. Your prison has no bars, it has compliments, it has labels, it has expectations. You are called a good man, a solid guy, the kind of man women should want. And you wear those words like armor until you realize that armor is also a cage. You provide, you protect, you stay calm, you listen, you carry the weight, and for this you are rewarded with what? Permission to stay, the illusion of peace, the slow death of your own desires. You were told to be patient. But no one ever told you what you were waiting for. Patience, they said, is love. Patience, they said, is strength. But what if patience is just a beautiful word for tolerating erasure? You do not yell, you do not leave, you endure. And that endurance is praised until you begin to question the cost. Because what they call patience is often a man slowly fading under the pressure to remain stable, noble, unfailing. And what they call virtue is often just the quiet compliance of a man who has been trained to believe that his worth is measured by how much he can endure without complaint. You want to be good. Of course you do. Because you were raised to believe that goodness will be returned with love. But somewhere along the line, you began to sense that your goodness is being used, not cherished. that your predictability is not admired but expected, that your sacrifices are not seen but assumed, that your silence is not strength but compliance. You've been told again and again that you are lucky to be needed, but need is not the same as love, and stability is not the same as belonging, and being good is not the same as being free. No one ever told you that being the good man often means being the one who never gets to fall apart, the one who holds space for everyone else while no one notices the space closing in around him. You are not in danger, you are in devotion. But devotion, when unreturned, becomes servitude. And here you are, standing in the invisible cage made of your own principles, wondering if dignity means dying quietly with your mask still on. But what if goodness is not the answer? What if the true rebellion is not in rage, but in reclaiming the right to ask, who am I, when I am no longer performing what the world expects of a man? The cage only holds you if you forget the door is not locked. But to step out, that would mean disappointing someone. It would mean becoming the villain in someone else's story. It would mean being misunderstood, and that is what keeps most men inside. Not bars, not fear, but the unbearable weight of being seen as not good. And yet, the soul does not thrive on reputation. It thrives on truth, even if that truth costs you the applause. Illusions don't shatter with a scream. They dissolve, slowly, quietly, like fog receding when the sun begins to rise and you realize the landscape around you isn't what you thought it was. There's no thunder, no applause, just stillness. And in that stillness, a man sits with the version of himself he's tried to outrun for years. He is not proud, he is not broken, he is simply there. The masks are gone, not ripped off in rebellion but laid down in surrender. The provider, the protector, the pleasing presence, they've all grown too heavy to carry. And in their place stands a man with calloused hands and a quiet heart, finally asking the question he has avoided his whole life. Who am I when I am no longer who they needed me to be? For the first time, he is not performing. He is not being evaluated. He is not editing himself for approval. There is no one left to impress. And somehow that emptiness, so terrifying at first, starts to feel like space, like oxygen. Carl Jung called it individuation, not a destination but a becoming. A slow, sacred returning to the self, not the self built from culture or coping, but the one buried beneath years of survival. It does not come with clarity. It begins in confusion. It feels like loss because it is. The loss of the man he thought he had to be. The loss of certainty, the loss of innocence. But under the grief something stirs, like roots shifting in dark soil, a whisper, a pulse. This, Jung said, is the soul calling itself back. And that soul does not speak in commands. It doesn't ask for obedience. It waits, patiently. Like an old friend who never left, just waited in the shadows for you to stop running. The journey inward is not clean. It is not noble. It is messy, primal, and full of doubt. But it is yours. For the first time, wholly yours. No longer are you dancing for warmth. No longer are you bargaining for love. No longer are you holding your breath, hoping someone else will declare you enough. You begin to realize all the strength you thought you needed to keep others happy is the same strength you now need to come home to yourself. And it is hard, because no one claps when you say no. No one celebrates when you choose solitude over performance. No one calls it brave when you refuse to trade authenticity for approval. But that's how you know it's real. This isn't healing to be admired. This is survival. This is reanimation. This is soul retrieval. And slowly, something in you that was once silent begins to speak. Not loudly, not fluently, but honestly. A man who has sat with his own silence becomes dangerous, not to others, but to the illusions that once ruled him. Because now he knows, the love he wanted cannot be found through appeasement. The peace he craved was never hers to give. And the self he buried is the only thing worth resurrecting. He is not yet free, but he is facing the right direction, and sometimes that is enough. Not every ending requires fire. Some come like fog lifting from the fields at dawn, soft, inevitable, full of quiet revelations. This isn't rage. This isn't revenge. This is the moment a man stops trying to belong to places that were never sacred. You are not her shadow, not her reflection, not the silent witness to her needs. You are not a provider dressed as a partner. You are not a transaction made human. You are not a role cast in someone else's narrative. You are a soul, and souls cannot be owned. They cannot be bartered for comfort. They cannot be loved into submission. What you called love was not love. It was a script, and you played it so well that even you believed it was your truth. But the lines no longer fit, the scenes no longer resonate, and the applause no longer matters. She may have held your hand, but she never held your being. And now, something in you remembers that your body was not built to carry someone else's emptiness, that your heart was not made to decode someone else's silence, that your voice was not designed to echo only what keeps the peace. You are not hers. You never were. She may have called it partnership, but it was a contract. She may have called it connection, but it was containment. She may have called it devotion, but it was dependency. And you, aching, loyal, good-hearted, mistook captivity for closeness because you were never taught that love doesn't require disappearance. But now you know. And knowing is the quietest kind of freedom. So leave, not with bitterness, not with blame, but with reverence for the man you had to become just to survive the illusion. Leave not from her, but from the lie that you ever needed her to feel whole. Leave not to escape, but to return, to breath, to silence, to self, because in the end what she took was not yours to keep, and what remains is everything. It doesn't end with a shout, not with a slammed door or a triumphant exit. There is no dramatic monologue, no audience to applaud the closing scene. There is only quiet, a breath, a pause, the soft flicker of something ancient and unfinished, still burning in the dark. You don't need to raise your voice to reclaim your life. You don't need to prove your worth to someone who never saw it. You don't need to be louder. You just need to stop running. Sit down, not out of defeat, but as a ritual, a return. Because within you, beneath all the learned responses and tired roles, there is still a flame. It is not bold, it does not roar, but it has never gone out. That flickering light is the part of you that was never trained, never silenced, never sold. It is the boy who once dreamed without asking permission, the man who once laughed without calculating the cost, the soul who once stood in front of the mirror, not to check for approval but simply to see who was there. He is still here, waiting, not for her, not for the world, but for you to remember, to notice, to listen to the silence and finally hear it speaking, because the truest parts of you will never demand attention. They wait with reverence, with patience, with a kind of love that does not bargain. You were never meant to vanish to be loved. You were never meant to shrink to be safe. You were never meant to perform to feel real. So let the candle burn. Let it flicker and smoke. Let it be small, but let it be yours. And in that quiet light, perhaps you'll hear the one truth that has always been waiting at the edge of your becoming. Embrace the man you are when no one is watching. He is the one who will set you free.